Right, so I'm here today with Liz Jenkins, and Liz is with Educational Freedom. They have a website, a very, very helpful website with lots of information for people who are starting out with home education, already home educating as well, lots of advice and support. Liz, before we go any further, do you want to just quickly tell us a little bit about Educational Freedom?
Yep, Educational Freedom started up in 2013. It was started up by myself and another person, and the reasoning why we started up was because we wanted information to be available in one place, because all this information was available previously, but you had to go searching through different websites or different internet forums or Yahoo groups as they were at the time. So we've just basically put everything all in one place, made it freely accessible for everybody, whether they're on Facebook or not.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. So what we're going to be talking about today is this whole thing of you've decided or you're thinking about home educating. So it's but now you're not sure what happens next. What do you need to know? There's a lot of stereotypes about home education, and sometimes you yourself may have some of those stereotypes, and hopefully we can kind of unlock some of those and unpack some of those, and answer some of the questions that people have when they are thinking about home education but don't actually know what it's all about. And I'm just going to start out a little bit by saying, like, when I started home educating, which is actually 23 years ago, it was very much a case of, you heard about home education and you think, oh, that's something different. That sounds like something that might work for us. And hopefully, if you've got time, you can go and get some books or talk to lots of people, which I'd highly recommend. And, but even then, when you start out, you kind of there's still certain things that you having to learn all along and figure out. And I very much started off with a school at home approach with a full curriculum, for every child in my family. But spending quite a lot of money actually to do that. And I could probably have avoided some of that expense and some of the difficulties and challenges of trying to do a school at home approach. I don't know, Liz, when you started home educating, did you have any sort of specific idea beforehand?
No, my children never went to school. So I first heard about home education just on a parenting forum. Someone you mentioned it, and I kind of thought, oh, that's interesting, and then forgot about it. And then my elder daughter, she learned to read by herself when she was 3. So being a September baby, she'd have been 5 before she started school. And I didn't want her going to school and having to sit through picture books and then Biff, Chip, and whoever the other people are, and going through the Oxford Reading Tree and all that. I didn't want that for her. So I investigated home education at this point and decided, actually, yes, that's what works for us.
Yeah. So I think actually this is a good point to say, if your children are not in school yet and you are considering home education, what, Liz, would you say is the most important thing to know about what young children should be doing?
Okay, so if your children are not in school, you legally you don't have to tell anybody you're going to home educate. That is the default position, and you then have to apply for a school place. So you just keep doing what you're doing. You're already the parent. You've already been teaching your children for the first 4 or 5 years of their life. You already know what they like, what they dislike, what they're interested in, and you simply just have to facilitate that and just go with what your child wants.
Yeah, and personally, I would say play is probably the most important way your child can learn when they're young. There's numerous studies, numerous people you can go and watch and listen to that will back this up. But please, I would say don't stress about bookwork and that kind of thing when they are young, unless that child is like really loves that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel this is one way where I'm not necessarily the best advocate for home education, because my eldest daughter was a fluent reader. People think, oh, she was reading at 3, therefore my child must be reading at 3. But actually, in home education, there's no such thing as behind. So don't panic if your child is not reading at 4, at 5, at 6, at 7, even 8, 9, and 10, because actually, when you're not in a school environment, there are so many other ways to learn. You can learn through conversations, there are audiobooks, there are hands-on, there are museums, there are other places you can go visit. It is not book work, it is not just reading and writing.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the way there's some things that are important to do almost before you start home educating, and not everyone has the luxury of time, because sometimes you have to make a decision really, really quickly to get your child out of school. So you don't have the time to do the research. But I would say, like, some of the important things to do is to think about yourself as a family. What works for you? What works for your child? There's a thing that is referred to called deschooling. And I think it's not a term that's popular with local authorities, so we don't recommend you use the term with local authorities. But
yeah,
Liz,
in fact,
tell
in the
us,
recent guidance, it specifically says don't use that term because it sets off red flags.
But what do we mean by deschooling?
So when we talk about deschooling, we talk about it's two things. So first of all, it is important for the parent. The parent needs to deschool because they need to get out of their own head what they think education should look like. Education does not necessarily mean replicating what happens in a school. So even if, like myself, I enjoyed school, I like books and textbooks and workbooks and seeing how much I can get right in a test, that is not what education actually is. That just is bookwork. So deschooling is learning about all the different ways that education can take place and freeing yourself from any preconceptions.
Yes.
The other side of deschooling is for the children, particularly children who have been in a school environment or sometimes even nursery if it's attached to a school. And some children, when they start home educating, they think school home education must look like school, and they get themselves into a panic because if they're asked to write a story, they may think, well, you haven't told me what the story's about. They haven't yet got to terms with their own curiosity and their own imagination because they're so used to everything being prescribed in a school setting. So it's important for the child to take some time away from what they think education is as well. That doesn't mean there's no education taking place, just that is not replicating school.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I often say to adults, and I think it's worth, anyone you have a conversation with about home education, is if you think about your own learning as an adult, how much did you learn in school compared to how much you learned once you left school? Most people would say they learned far more after they left school than they did in school. And then when you ask them why that is, they'll say, well, because I was actually interested and I was passionate about the subject and I was able to do the learning I wanted to do. And then, the question is, well, why would it be different for our children? And so while we can do the appearance of like teaching and telling the child information, it may look like learning, but we don't actually know how much is actually going into that child's head and being retained. So it is really for appearance sake sometimes that you have a child sitting at a table with a book in front of them, but actually in reality, you've got to kind of figure out what really engages the child so that they are learning in a way that's meaningful for them, that enables them to gain mastery over their subject and to retain that knowledge because they're interested.
Absolutely. And as you go through the deschooling process, you might discover that actually your child genuinely does enjoy bookwork. But it's a process. You shouldn't necessarily assume just because they've been in school that they will continue learning that way. Similarly, there are cases where, particularly if your child has special educational needs or is autistic, they may actually prefer to have a delayed deschooling period. So they come out of school and they like the
structure,
routine and structure of having that, of knowing what they're doing. And then over time, you can decrease it and then they can deschool and you can decide whether to add it back in or not again.
Normally what I would recommend to parents, if the local authority does ask them, is instead of using the term deschooling, it's more appropriate to say we are taking some time. There's a period of adjustment, as you would assume, even if you move schools. If you move from one city to another and you move to another school, there would be a period of adjustment. If you move in countries, which some children do, I mean, it's a huge period of adjustment. It's to be expected. And I would normally say in a report, as expected, we are going through a period of adjustment to a new style of doing things and taking time to assess where my child's level is and how which approach will work best for them. So I would use that terminology instead, and then make it clear that education is still going on in some form or another. But
yeah,
I think
absolutely.
the whole idea of learning at a desk, baking is learning. Fiddling with Lego, playing with Lego, building things, that is all learning. I believe everything about life is learning. I had my son help me replace an element on my oven the other day, specifically so he could learn what it is to fix things, and that he needn't be daunted by it. So there's very little in life that you could. I mean, you would literally have to lock a child in a dark room for them not to learn.
Yes.
And we're not doing that, So they will be learning, and you kind of need to assure yourself as well that they will be learning. But I think with home education, it's really important to understand what ticks the boxes for your child, not for the local authority and not for yourself or anyone else.
Yes.
Yeah. So you take that time. So let's just talk. We spoke about now if you have a young child and that's never been to school, so legally there's no requirement for you to notify the local authority. If your child was already in school,
so
what
if
is
your
the process
child
then?
is in a mainstream school, whether the child has special educational needs or a EHCP or anything like that, if they're in a mainstream school, you need to deregister them. And this is simply writing a letter or an email. If you write a letter, make sure you get a receipt or proof of postage, just so that you've got a paper trail of what's been going on. But you send a letter to the head teacher simply requesting that they remove your child's name from the school roll because you will be home educating. And there is a sample letter on the Educational Freedom website if anybody wants to know the type of thing you can put in that letter.
And is this process different for Scotland and Wales?
Same process for Wales. It is different for Scotland. So in Scotland, you have to actually write to the Director of Education at your local authority and ask them if you can withdraw your child from school. Now, there should be no reasons why you can't, but you do have to go through the process of actually asking them.
Yeah.
If your child is in a private or independent school, you need to write to the head teacher, again, asking for your child to be removed from school. However, depending on the contract you have with that school, depends whether you can stop paying your fees at the end of this term or whether you actually have to pay an additional term, because some schools require you give a term's notice, not that you can leave at the end of that term.
Yeah, that's worth mentioning. Okay, so what would the process be for a child who has special educational needs? Because it also depends which school they're in, right?
Yeah, so as I said, if the child with SEN is in a mainstream school, you can just follow the normal deregistration if it's in England and Wales. If your child is in a special educational setting or a special school, then you do need to ask permission from the LA in order to withdraw your child from school.
And I know the guidance says that they mustn't be unreasonable about this.
Yes. Yeah. And there are some cases, there are some examples in case law, so that if you are having difficulty removing your child from a special school, please get in contact, because there are ways that we can help you with that if it is genuinely in the best interest of your child.
Yes, and we can come back to sort of different support systems that exist for home educators at the end, before we finish off. Okay, so we've spoken about withdrawing a child from school. What are some of the other things we need to know legally? If your child is, if you move areas, do you need to notify anybody?
No, at the moment, if you move areas, you do not need to tell anyone. If you are in contact with your local authority, it is wise to inform them that you are moving house, because otherwise your child could be classed as a child missing education. However, you are not obliged to give your current LA your new address that might be in another area.
Okay, yeah. And if once you are known to your local authority and they start interacting with you, what is the what sort of contact should we expect? What can they ask of home educators?
Yeah, so assuming your child has been in school, you write to your school, and it's the school's responsibility to inform the local authority that your child will now be home educated. So you don't need to contact the LA directly at all. Once the LA becomes aware that your child is home educated, normally they will get in touch within a few weeks or a month just to check that they are being home educated. And you can reply, as Juliet said, English, saying that you are finding your feet, and you can ask to be contacted again at a later date. You will have to often give a report quite soon after you've started home educating. Unfortunately, this is something that many local authorities seem to be doing, but you need to remember that you have been home educating as soon as your child has been removed from the register. Even if you've not been sitting at a desk all that time, that doesn't matter. You can educate how you want. You need to write a report, which I'll go into what a report contains later on. And then once you've written the report, the LA would normally be in contact to say, yes, we're happy. We will now be in touch in 1 year's time. And so it's quite common just to have an email once a year saying, please, can you send us a report of how your education's going? And you just reply an updated report. And pretty much that's all you need to have contact with the LA.
Yeah. And what if they ask for more information? What if they're not happy?
So if the local authority is not happy, we would suggest writing a more detailed report. So I haven't covered what reports consist of. So to go through that briefly,
Yeah, I
it
think
needs to
probably a
be,
good idea. But we can, once again, the Educational Freedom website will have all the information if you need to go and find out more.
yes, we do have sample reports on our website. So you need to include what your approach to home education is. Sometimes that's called your educational philosophy. So that might be whether you're child-led, whether you're structured, whether you follow a specific method like Charlotte Mason, whether you are project-based or anything else. So you just give a brief overview of what your thoughts about education is. Then you should go through your report should state how you're meeting that education. So give a list of resources and don't forget the obvious ones. Libraries are free to use, TV programs have documentaries, there are internet sites, there are so many resources. And also say, if you are in contact, and if you're not, I recommend you come in contact quick, with local home educators. So you have support of peers who have been through it with you. You do not have to state what ability level your children have, and your children do not have to match school-based aged peers, if that makes sense. So if your child is 13, they do not have to match the what a 13-year-old in school would be doing.
Yes, well, the law states that we provide an education suitable to the child's age, aptitude, and ability.
Absolutely,
So
yes.
aptitude and ability come very much into it. If you have a child who is unable to cope with a certain standard, you can use that. And just I think sometimes it's recommended as well that if your child has records from their school, that you hang on to those for a little while, because you may need to if you ever need to show progress, you may be able to show So sometimes you can do that, just keep any sort of examples where your child was struggling, and maybe as a home educator you've had success and got them to improve. At least you got a benchmark, although we don't generally recommend sending in like examples of the child's actual work with a report, do we?
No. So yes, so with the report, you don't have to give examples of work. You do not need to give photographs of your child. You do not need to make your child sit any kind of tests or SATs. And also, this is an interesting thing, is recommended you speak in the past tense and the present tense when you're writing reports. You can say, this is what we have been doing, this is what we are doing. And if you feel the need to write in future tense, make it vague. So something like, I would like my child to do exams if they are willing and able. Because if you try to be specific when you're in the future tests, or in the future tense, sometimes local authorities will pick up on that and say, so this time last year, you said your next project was going to be on World War II. How did that go? And you say, oh, actually, my child decided they weren't interested in the wars anymore. So instead, we learned this. And they go, you didn't follow through. Big red mark. So it's important to try not to speak in the future tense.
Yeah, I think it would be fine if you had already perhaps registered your child for an exam or two. That would probably be okay. Yes. To say he's signed up to do this and this year, because you've already actually done that. But you do have to think a little bit about how you share, and just realize that it's about what is suitable for your child. And when it comes to listing resources, you might think it's obvious to list people you've got books in your home, or felt tips or whatever, but it's not a bad thing to say, to list everything, to show your child is totally not deprived of like the normal little things in life. And the one misconception though is that people often think that, as I said previously, that learning takes place in a specific environment, that the child is sitting at a table in a room with 4 walls, therefore they must be learning. And we find as home educators actually that we often are not at home very often, are we? There's this all of those experiences, being out and about, those all count as learning experiences, don't they? Yeah. We went to Rome, and travel is an amazing way to educate, actually, just exposing your child to different experiences. And Rome was, we had the wonderful opportunity to go and visit all these historic sites. And it doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be Rome, it can be Stonehenge, it can be, you've always mentioned all of these things that you're doing that indicate what I think it's more about what you're exposing your child to as well.
Yes, and that sparks their own imagination and curiosity. So if you go to whether it's a National Trust site or anything, you don't have to go beforehand and think like you would if your child was in school, I should make a worksheet for my child to go around ticking off and writing and drawing. Actually, let your child explore themselves. Let them climb up castle ruins. I mean, obviously, not if it's dangerous, but let them see what it's like to look through the arrow slits and to imagine what it would be like to shoot an arrow, or what it's like to wonder about how, you mentioned Stonehenge, how those stones got from Wales, where they think the stone came from, all the way to the middle of Wiltshire without using the machinery that we've got today.
Yeah, and I think this brings me to sort of another thing that we can discuss just briefly is, you mentioned about different approaches and so on, like what you might write in your report of different approaches. Let's perhaps just run through what some of the options are that people may want to consider or go and research further. So, you mentioned Charlotte Mason. So Charlotte Mason is a specific philosophy towards home education, but Charlotte Mason is a lovely sort of nature study based, literature based
and literature based. And I'm somebody, and I love reading, and I said my daughter learned to read early, but she hates actually reading. So as much as this is a case where, as much as I may have liked to have encouraged my children to read lots and lots and lots because I like to read lots, it's not something that would have suited them.
Yes, and I think that's important in considering an approach, is to understand that what works for you may not work for your child, which is why you don't just, you consider there's several things to consider in approaches. First of all, it's what you as a parent feel you can manage to deliver, and what will work for you, because you're going to facilitate your child's education. The second thing is obviously your child, and this is no particular order, by the way, they're all kind of equal priority. What does your child respond well to? Are they a child who just needs to be outdoors all the time? Or are they a child who loves lots of bookwork and lots of coloring in, or likes crafts, or needs to be building things all the time? So you consider all of those things. And then another thing to consider as a family, what's going to work for you as a family, because you may be home educating more than one child, and then you've got to try and figure out ways to fit around all the different individuals. But the beauty of home education is that you can actually tailor to the individual far more than a classroom ever can. So even though it can still be a challenge as a parent having different children, you're still not dealing with a class of 30. So there is that. Okay, so some of the other approaches, what are some other approaches that people follow?
So I did unschooling with my children, which is sometimes called autonomous learning. And it's allowing your children the freedom to take responsibility for their own learning. So I'd say there's two types of unschooling. So there's some people just do educational unschooling. So they let their children learn what they like, and they follow the child's interests and help facilitate that. And there's also what's called radical unschooling, which is where I sat more, or also it's called whole life unschooling. So you allow your children to actually make decisions about what they eat, what time they go to bed, what they do in their, I was going to say in their free time, but in all unschooling, it's all free time, yes. And that's much more a whole life. It's not, you cannot separate the life from the education with unschooling like that.
Yeah, and I think there, once again, it's what works for the family very much so, because the one thing I find it's difficult if you've got two parents, and if the parents are not in agreement on the approach, that can actually pose some serious problems and cause some trouble. So it is important that you're kind of all on the same page with regards to the approach you're going to follow. So some people follow very structured approaches where they might like subscribe to an online program.
Yeah, some people will buy in a full curriculum. If you do a search, there are many different providers available online. So that curriculum will come and you'll work through it in progress. Some of them have online tutorials. Some of them you just essentially get the books, but you can do the tests online. They all work in slightly different ways, but other structured people actually like to follow the national curriculum but make that up themselves. So they like to know, what would my child be learning if they were in school? They're learning this topic, so I will find out and do the work to provide the worksheets that they'll be learning.
Okay, great.
And
that's also very specific again to a family, because some people might start off very structured thinking that's the way to go, and then after a while they find actually it doesn't work, and so they adjust and adapt. And yeah,
and some people are what they call semi-structured. So they like to make sure that they've got the maths, the English, and maybe science as well covered. So they might use workbooks that you can get in WH Smith's or other providers, and they make their child do a certain amount every day of each of those. Or it might be maybe using a workbook once or twice a week, but then doing more practical or reading the practical maths or practical science or reading as part of the English. And then for the other subjects, they're more go the other way and do unschooling and let their children experience life and follow.
I was a bit like that, because I started off quite structured, and then life happened and a couple more babies and things kind of just got a little bit muddled, and I eventually decided, after different phases. My ultimate, what I ended on was, please just do a bit of maths and a bit of English every day, because that was to tick my guilt box. So I could feel like, okay, I can at least keep them on track for their age, because and then everything else was fun. Everything else was sort of self-directed, or we would do it as a group and do it together, because that's what I could manage, because I actually had 7 children, but not all home educating to the same, because some of them were just like toddlers, one running around, and but that was what worked for us, because they were already by that time independent enough that they could get on with the individual work, and I never made it so onerous that they were resistant. It was, they were quite happy to do a few pages a day. Later on, we used an online maths program just to keep them up to date with the maths. And sometimes I felt like I wasn't doing anything at all. But ultimately, all of them have gone on. I've still got one busy with GCSEs now, but all of them have gone on and maybe done some exams, gone to college. Some have gone to uni. Some went to college and went into work or self-employed. And so all of them are actually, either in the process of becoming independent and sustaining themselves, or fully sustaining themselves and living married or whatever. So it's interesting. The longer I go on, the more I realize that actually so much of what is in a school curriculum is actually entirely random and arbitrary. You've got a committee somewhere deciding, okay, Battle of Hastings in this year, and Wars of the Roses this year, and the Romans, and often, the kids, they learn it because they were their class, but it doesn't stick because they don't even have context. They don't even understand where it fitted in. Whereas I like to follow, like with the history, we always did it chronologically. So we were always building on the previous culture, and we tended to do any history together with some friends, bit of fun, and go on trips to the British Museum to go, and so we'd learn about the Egyptians, and you go to the British Museum and go and look at all the mummies and see it. You can actually totally build everything in to fit into what you're doing. And so it's, ultimately that's what we found worked for us, was a combination. I wish I was brave enough sometimes to do, total sort of unschooling, but we have our personalities. And I've got one daughter who, when we went out of structured life and moved house and everything was a bit out of her control, she actually had some mental health issues around that. So you have to look at what works for your child to keep, because also, to me, mental health is like the key thing. A child is not going to learn if they're unhappy or upset or stressed and anxious. You can make them look like they're learning at a desk, but it's once again, it just looks like it. It doesn't mean that it's sticking. And stress and anxiety, mental health issues, we're seeing a lot of those recently. Parents removing their children for those reasons, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see some other questions. So now, are there specific hours, because we've spoken about unschooling and all of that? Now, is there somebody that says, oh, but you must be doing so many hours of whatever?
Yeah, so legally, there's no definition. According to the guidance, it specifically says home educators do not need to follow the school hours. They do not need to follow the school days, and nor do they need to be following the school terms, which is great for home educators because it means you can go on holiday when it's a bit cheaper.
Yep.
And if a day, like at the moment, the weather's been beautiful, hasn't it? So you can take trips to the beach and go learn about how different rock formations have been, and how cliffs, and look at tides and the sea. And you don't need to be inside learning calculus because that's what it says on your timetable today. You actually have the freedom and the flexibility to learn when you want. So you may stay up all night looking at some comets that are going overhead and then sleep in the next day. You really do have the flexibility to facilitate your life around what's best for your children.
Yeah, I actually love to use an example about my son, who was, I suppose, about 6 or 7. And we hadn't really been following, because by the time I got to my 6th and 7th children, I was like, well, learn when you can, just whatever, and I was totally relaxed, and they were all fine. But he came one Saturday and said to me, and this is like, as I said, it's a Saturday, it's not like in your school hours or whatever, and he was like, oh, how long does it take to get from Babylon to I think it was Egypt, somewhere in Egypt or whatever. So we went and we had a look and we figured it out, and then we started looking at, okay, so this is where the Suez Canal is, and we ended up going and watching a film about the Suez Canal and how it was built, and we spent about 4 hours jumping from one thing to the next, that basically following where his nose was leading on each thing. In 4 hours, the amount of content he covered, because he was interested in it, it was probably more than, it was like 3 weeks worth if you were like doing it through a program, whatever, but that was his desire. And I think that's the thing, is that when you're home educated, it actually is full-time. It doesn't get more full-time, and it's in the car when you happen to drive past something and your child remembers that, oh, we were just talking about this the other day, or you notice it and you say, remember, we were just talking about that, and then because you, as the facilitator, you're much more connected to what your child is doing, so you can have that follow through.
Yeah, with my girls, like I said, we did unschooling, and the most formal work we did was through conversations when we were waiting for the bus. And we used to play maths games. So I'd ask them, like, what comes next in the sequence? And they'd have to come up with the next 2 or 3 numbers. And then they'd ask me a question, and vice versa. Or you, like you said, you start off with a conversation about something, and it just meanders around.
Yeah, and I had a son who was very, he used to take a pile, also like at the age of 6 or 7, he took a stack of science books to bed with him every night. And that was his nighttime reading. And he would come to me and he'd open the book and say, can we do this experiment? And so we'd have to do the experiment. And I remember we did the one of sort of evaporation. So I wanted to demonstrate it. So I had a pan out with some water and we heated it up and we saw how it formed the steam. And then we put the lid there so it could form condensation, and the water went back in, and it kind of explaining how this is almost like the water cycle. And then we were driving along and he was asking something, and it all tied in with that, with the clouds, discussing clouds. And because I'd been connected with him, so it's a very different form of learning, but it's extremely efficient.
Yes.
Because you're not spending a lot of time getting to, the child is already there. And sometimes it takes a while to get to that point, to get out of that school environment. So just going back to that again.
And talking about efficiency, someone's done the calculations, and they reckon that if you were to follow the school curriculum, you could get it through every subject in 2 hours a day, even up to the GCSE years. You can still do with just 2 hours of one-on-one, or 2-on-1, or 7-to-1 maybe.
Yeah, because you're not in a busy classroom where the teacher's having to deal with children who've got issues, and the children have to settle down and get ready, and then wait till everyone's caught up. You're in a very different environment, and you've got the child is actually in control. I often talk to parents about training their children to take over the steering wheel for their own education, and to bring them to that point, because as a teenager, the most effective learning certainly is when they are in charge and have the motivation to go forward. So let's have a little look and see what other questions we had. We've answered actually a lot of these.
Yes. Whilst you're looking, I just want to bring up something that's off the back of something you said earlier about your son trying to find out how long it would go from Babylon to Egypt. Is that some people think that in order to home educate, you need to be a teacher, or you need to have qualifications, or you need to know everything about everything in the whole world ever. And that is not the case, thankfully.
No one operates like that out in the real world.
No. So as a parent, you just have to be willing to facilitate your child's learning. You do not have to teach them. You can learn alongside them. You can direct them to the best websites to use to find that information out for themselves, or take them to the library or to a museum.
Find a video.
Yes, absolutely.
I love a good
So
video.
a lot of people do get, especially when they first started thinking about home educating, especially for the secondary years, and they get a bit worried that they weren't good at maths themselves, or they don't like Shakespeare, or whatever it is that your hang-ups from your own schooling. That's where, again, deschooling can help, because you realise that actually there are other ways to learn. And once you're interested, or your child's interested, and I can say this as someone who hated history at school, my daughter loves history. And following her, she was so enthusiastic about it. It just made me interested, even though it's not how I naturally am. So seeing your child's curiosity and imagination, you can help them along that and be drawn along with them.
Yeah, I also developed a love for history from home educating, not from school. And just going and researching, because the children would ask a question and I'd go and try and find the right answer. And then, and you just find out how interesting it all was. So let's just look at a couple of other questions about, so resources and equipment. What would you say are good things to have in your home?
So I would say these days, a computer or something with internet access, whether it's a tablet or even a phone if you don't have a laptop, just because there is so much available online, so many courses, resources, ideas, apps, software, all this kind of thing for free as well. I mean, there's a lot you can pay for, but there actually is a surprising amount that you can access for free. And also the connectivity with other home educators through the internet, through Facebook, through various organisations. Actually, I'd say that's an essential. A library card, I'd say, is quite up there, because again, well, I mean, I like books, but going into a library and say, take your pick. You
Yeah,
don't
you
have
can
to
only
stick
keep
to
so
the,
many in your house.
yes. But telling the children they don't have to stick to the children's books. They can actually access the whole library and choose what they want to learn. It's incredible. At a basic level, pens, paper, a good calculator, because again, I'm a maths tutor as well, so always have a good calculator to hand. But honestly, that's about it in terms of things that are necessary.
Yeah.
Textbooks can be borrowed from the library, borrowed from other people. There's stuff online.
Lots of stuff online. There's lots of websites that you can download things from, and Pinterest.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, nice to have some art and craft materials. A National Trust membership is a nice to have, because if you're going during term time, there is a home ed discount with the National Trust, but you can only use it Monday to Friday during term time. So if you want to go with extended family on a weekend, that may not be the best option.
Yeah. I would say outings is honestly for a lot of children is really a great way to learn. Just a great hands-on experience way to learn. And my approach generally was that in the primary years, learning should be fun. Anything you should do should be enjoyable, because what you want your children, you want to ignite a love of learning. You want to spark their interest. You don't want to kill dead any curiosity they've got. You want to awaken it. And once you get into the secondary years and you're starting to see the child's character come through more, and their own ideas of what they want to do, you start kind of guiding them a little bit towards choosing and thinking of their own direction and taking control, and understanding that you will support them in their learning. So I always think of it, that's when you start aiming your arrows in the secondary years. So the early bit is just really enjoyable and fun, and just doing life together.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say regarding resources is try not to buy anything for the first month or 2 months. I'm somebody who I like to plan, and if I've got an idea, I will go search it out and buy everything I can. And then you're stuck with stuff that doesn't get used, because actually your children have other ideas. So it's always a good idea to see what you can get for free first. If you do think there's an online course or resource that you need to pay for, see if they've got a free trial period, to see if you can borrow it from somebody else or have personal recommendations about what's good before you spend the money.
Yeah, that's very true. And you know, good gifts, if family members ask for good gifts, the things like the memberships to National Trust and all of that. English Heritage, good to know, is that if you book 3 weeks in advance, you can go for free as a home educator.
And it's similar, I believe, in Gatto in Wales, that if you email them in advance, sometimes they will give you access for free to the various
very
sites.
useful for Stonehenge, which is English Heritage. Yeah. So one of the other things that I wanted to ask is, so we've been talking a little bit about secondary, and one of the big concerns, a lot of people say, oh, your child won't be able to take exams. Now, this is not true.
Yes, not true at all. So if so regarding exams, you have the freedom to study whatever exam you want as a home educator, whether it be GCSEs or IGCSEs, which is the international GCSEs, which home educators quite often choose to do instead of GCSEs because of the lack of coursework element. You could skip GCSEs and go to A levels. You could do HND, HNC. You could do BTEC. Some people, I believe, do Open University modules and just do a couple of those in order to access a standard brick university.
I know of some doing American SATs as well.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
So what you can do as home educators is actually far faster than what you can do at school. However, you have to be able, as the parent, to pay for those exams and facilitate where they are going. So if you go for the subject choice and qualification choice first, it may mean you have to travel somewhere else in the country in order to sit that exam.
Yeah.
So other people do it, which sounds a bit backwards, but they contact their local exam centres and local colleges, find out if their children can sit the exams there first. And if it's a yes, then ask the exam centre or college what syllabus, and then choose the exams based on what's locally available. And that will be a smaller choice, but you still have the flexibility to do one subject a few years early or only do a few exams at a time.
Yeah, I know of home educators who've done their GCSEs at age 12. So you can if your child is capable.
Yeah, and as we've said before, once your child is interested in a subject, they will deep dive. So actually, it's not as amazing as it sounds to say people, home educators, are doing their GCSEs early, because if they have that interest, they will want to learn it.
Yeah, my son did his first one at 13 because it was kind of a trial just to see how it went for him, and you can stagger them. You don't have to do them all at once like you would in school. And I can also say that there are some of my children who've literally entered an exam. We did the entry around January for the summer sitting. We ordered the books after that, and they prepared for the exam in that time. So they literally, over the period of 4 or 5 months, prepared for the exam. So that is entirely possible. It does depend on the subject, depends on the child, but they don't always need like a full 2 years to prepare for an exam. And when a child is motivated, that is half your job done.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's also the opportunity in some places for home educated children to go to pre-16s at college. So the home educated child has to be 14 and would be in year 10 at school. Unfortunately, if it's an older child, they can't be 14 and in year 9, they won't be accepted into college. But you can go to college at 14 and do 2 or 3 GCSEs, but still be classed as home educated, but be treated as an adult. So it's a totally different way of working than they would be if they were at school. And that's useful to know, especially if you've got a child who didn't get on with secondary school to begin with because it was too structured. Actually, if they're at college, they are treated like a young adult.
Yeah, and that's not all colleges, but you can ask from your local community. You can ask,
Yes.
about that. And we've also made use of it. Some exam centers are more pricey, so it is a question of inquiring and asking around. And I'm going to just use this opportunity to go into talking about resources. So on Facebook, there's a load of resources and groups available to assist and help parents. So there is one specifically on exams. So hopefully when I put this video out, I can add some links. So there is a group for parents who are considering exams to kind of help their children. And there's an exam wiki.
Yes.
With lots of information, and people share information. So you can ask about your area and find out what's available in your area as well. You can ask about exam content if you've got any questions. People are very helpful with sharing past papers, all this kind of thing. So that's a good group to join. There's another one which is called Home Education Success Without Exams, and that tends to be a lot of quite a few people on that group are doing American SATs, which is a different form and a different kind of setup, but it's very intriguing, actually, quite interesting to look at. Another very helpful group will help you with if you're having issues with your local authority. Basically, if you're having problems with your local authority, it's not necessarily for people who are where you have no issues and you're just getting on just fine. It's called Home Education and Your Local Authority Help with Dealing with Officialdom. So that's a very useful supportive group if you are having issues, deregistering, if you are having issues with the local authority, a lot of support to be found there. Then another good tip to find your local group is to just type into Facebook, Home Education, and the name of your town or the name of your county or your area. And that will normally bring up any groups that are local to you. And there are a wide number of national groups as well. Home Education UK, and there's a Christian Home Education UK. Some of the others, I think there's a Homeschooling UK group as well.
And there's Educational Freedom.
Educational Freedom, and Educational Freedom has a Facebook page. Streams has a Facebook page. Although Streams is not so much, we're dealing more with support in the support and equipping sort of side of things. Whereas you'll find Educational Freedom will give you a lot of that sort of legal advice and answering very specific questions and giving the templates, which is extremely helpful, how to write a letter, how to write a report. If you're new to this, it's just an amazing resource. And there just are many groups out there, and there are home educators all over the UK. You need not be isolated. I just mentioning isolation. One of the things people often ask is, are home educators isolated or not getting social exposure or whatever? Let's just say I don't think that's a problem for any of us. It's one of those silly comments that people make out of ignorance, but unless you as an adult are locking yourself in your own home all the time and not venturing out, your child will not have any problems. And one of the benefits of home education, I find, is that children learn to relate to people older and to people younger than them, instead of just limited to their own age group, and have no problem whatsoever being articulate and chatty with people of all ages. That's really positive. So any other helpful websites you can think of, or books that you've read, blogs?
So a book that I found particularly useful it's an American book, so it is talking about the American education system, but it's by John Gatto Taylor, or it might be Taylor Gatto. Yes, I always get his name around the wrong way. Weapons of Mass Instruction.
Yeah, and Dumbing Us Down is another one that was written. Yeah, because it explains kind of the agendas of the education system, so that you understand what the state tends to want to achieve with your children, when actually it might not align with what you want for your children. So it's good to understand that and to have an insight into that. I've read quite a lot of American books actually that covers some amazing topics. There was one called Minding Your Own Business, which is by Raymond and Dorothy Moore. And one of your questions that we had was about being self-employed and home educating. And Raymond and Dorothy Moore's book, which is printed years ago, but it just talks about like having a family business and how that you can, as a home educator, it's you just, family businesses and home education can go hand in hand. I think, that's a whole other topic. If you're working or if you're a single parent, that's a topic I'd like to cover in another conversation, I think. But yeah, I know that Ross Mountney, she has a blog.
Yes, she's
really
got a lot of good books as well.
Yeah. And then there's Ed Yourself, which is Fiona Nicholson, where she's covered a lot of the legal stuff and the special educational needs legal stuff. Education Otherwise is another big organization here in the UK, and their website has also been updated to cover a lot of helpful information. And that's a membership organization where there's certain benefits to signing up as a member. There's also CHESS, which is Christian Home Education Support Services, where they also have like a membership structure, and you can connect with other home educators. They run like every second year they have a conference, they have a camp, like family camp every year, family holiday. So a lot of groups, very active home educators are becoming, quite busy and active in all areas. I'm just trying to think if there's any other blogs or books to bring up. I've just been checking out Homegrown Sunshine, Alberta Stevens. She has a nice blog. Leah Bowden.
Quite a lot of home educators have got their own blogs. I mean, I've got my blog, which is Musings of a Middle-Aged Mum. A friend's got a blog called Curiosity-Led Learning. Yeah, if you were to just type home education blogs UK, loads will.
Yes, and I run a conference every year just for home educators, which is called the Learn Free Conference,
which I highly recommend as well.
Thank you. But I think we really try and make sure home educators get all the information they need for anything on there. There are also lots of blogs on unschooling.
Yes.
And websites on that, and pretty much any approach you're interested in. I would say for the best support, though, go to fellow home educators. Generally, any sort of government websites, local authority websites, even with people that provide curriculum, even these online curricula, they don't always get it right. So if you want proper information on home education, go to home educators. Another one I've remembered was Organic Education, which is Alice Camasia's blog. That's quite a good one. She followed a self-directed approach. And yeah, I would just encourage you as a parent to read as much as possible. Talk to as many people as you can. You as a parent will grow. You as a parent will change and transform, as will your family, when you choose home education, because it is a lifestyle change for you. And it just really is such a positive choice for your family. So I'm going to thank Liz right now for her time. I just appreciate all your knowledge and everything so much, Liz, and what you bring to the home education community. Appreciate that so much. Thank you for joining me today.
No problem.